The Another Code series was brought to you by a development studio known as Cing, which was headed by Rika Suzuki. Now, Rika was one of the mothers of the mystery/visual novel genre over in Japan under the company she founded, Riverhill Soft, who are most known for the J.B. Harold murder series. She had quite an esteemed career over there for her engaging mysteries that often broke the fourth wall by including things like notebooks and other little pieces of evidence that you would analyze in the real world, which would then apply over into the game. If you want to know more about her game design philosophy and just the history of Cing and Riverhill Soft, I recommend this interview by the Game Preservation Society on YouTube. Rika went independent and formed her own game studio, Cing, and she wanted to work with Nintendo, and so she wrote up a proposal for a mystery title, Another Code. This would be her first title with the female protagonist, Ashley Mizuki Robbins. She wanted to make a coming-of-age tale that teens could relate to. Cing would include the Nintendo DS itself as an integral piece of technology within the plot and key to solving the game's mysteries. Nintendo approved a small budget for the game, and it was developed in under a year, with the development beginning in February of 2004, and it was released in Japan in February of 2005. In North America, the game was released under the localized name Trace Memory. Nintendo of America had a trend of rebranding their titles to market them around the gimmicks of the platform. This is why the memory technology known as Another was called Trace within the game, because you trace sometimes with the stylus on the DS. Haha, I wonder what would have happened if Nintendo had chosen to localize the sequel Another Code R, as they would have run into a problem considering that there was no tracing happening on the Wii. Guess we'll never know because they didn't. North America never got the sequel to Trace Memory until the Recollection came out. Another Trace Memory centers around our teenage protagonist, Ashley Mizuki Robbins. She got a letter from her dead, not dead father, Richard. In the letter, Richard beckons her to go meet him on the desolate Blood Edward Island, where he would then explain everything, why he was dead but not dead all these years. He also sent her a launch model Nintendo DS. In the universe of Another Code, this handheld is called the DAS, or Dual Another System. The game is presented in a dual screen fashion. The top screen shows off things like characters speaking or the current area you're in, and it shuffles out various locations like slideshows as you move through the levels. The bottom screen is where the characters move around in a Nintendo 64 world from a top-down perspective. I kind of like this low poly cell shading thing it's got going on. It lends a bit of a timeless quality to this presentation. The bottom screen also takes care of all of your touchscreen related puzzles as well as user interface type of things. The game itself is only about a few hours long, but in those few hours, it provides a lot of unique puzzles that just could not be replicated on the Nintendo Switch hardware. The puzzles in the game took full advantage of every basic Nintendo DS gimmick and occasionally would throw in some wild outside-the-box uses for the system.
By using Nintendo technology in the game world and in the real world, you had a deeper connection to the game's story. You felt included.
Two puzzles in particular stood out to me. The first is a puzzle where Ashley has to stamp a page to solve a puzzle. Now, how do I stamp the paper? Well, now I don't know what to do. I'm just gonna fold this DS in frustration and putting the DS in sleep mode was the solution. A smile went across my face once this revelation hit me. The other, more infamous puzzle is where you're presented with two screens filled with odd symbols. Naturally, you would assume you could superimpose these two images with the camera, like you're supposed to do for other puzzles in the game, but no. The solution is much more ingenious than that. You have to take your Nintendo DS and place it on a surface and angle it in such a way that the two screens reflect and provides you with the solution of where the key is at. These kind of fourth wall breaking experiences were just not able to be replicated in Another Code Recollection on the Switch. Notably, the Switch is missing a second screen, and while it does have a touch screen, they don't really utilize it all that much. Stylus control is unofficially supported by games like Colors Live, but nobody else bought that game but me, so this is just some obscure fact I thought I would throw in. I will report that the Colors Live stylus is kind of weird to use and not as responsive as the DS. It seems like the majority of the puzzles were completely overhauled to reflect this new system, and a lot of the magic was lost along the way. But in my opinion, that just gives people a reason to revisit the originals. And I totally recommend playing the original so you can compare the two on your own and see where you agree and disagree with this video.
Hurry, Ashley. Hide. What do you hope to accomplish?
Mommy?
Game 1 in the Recollection is another Code 2 Memories, aka Trace Memory. They drop our protagonist Ashley in the middle of the forest outside the Edward estate, which differs from the original where it started on the boat. I believe this choice was made to get players familiar with the new 3D movement. The camera XY sweep is set to a sluggish 30, which may cause players to presume the game is struggling to pan the camera. You can actually crank up the speed of the camera, and I recommend setting these up to about 75 from the start, so it's not as disorienting. Another series first is the inclusion of voice acting. Personally, I don't think the voice acting adds much to the drama. You can choose to mute the dialogue or swap out the English voices with a Japanese cast.
待って、お待たせ。あ、アシュレイ、パソコンなんだけどさ。
There's only one puzzle during this tutorial segment where you just lay down some planks to make a bridge, and the puzzles rarely get more creative than this, unfortunately. From here, we cut back to Ashley on the ship as she's sailing to Blood Edward Island. The introductory flashback to Ashley's 3rd birthday lacks the same impact as the DS original. Even though the original is presented as a series of still frames, the suggestion of the murder and its impact on Ashley is more effective here. The morose soundtrack begins to swell with the low-quality string sense that the DS produced. In many ways, the DS version accomplished so much more with so much less fidelity. Something, but the Nintendo Switch version has HD graphics, and I will contend the Wind Waker cel-shading presentation is appealing to the eye, but there's so much more that makes up a game in my opinion. Ashley got a letter from her supposedly dead father. In it, he tells Ashley that he's alive and he's been living on the abandoned Blood Edward Island. He wants her to visit so they can discuss why he went into hiding. He enclosed a tablet known as the DAS, the Duel Another System, which this time around is modeled after the Nintendo Switch Lite, as the Joy-Cons are fused to the system, and therefore not a part of the puzzle solving. So it's just one giant tablet. Why didn't they just make this for the Wii U? It's very strange that they retained the dual part of the naming convention, considering there's only a single screen.
Wasn't someone supposed to meet you here?
Strange. I wonder if something came up.
So Ashley's Aunt Jessica goes out to look for Richard. Ashley gets tired of waiting, goes up to look for Jessica, and Captain Fox sails away, thus leaving Ashley alone on Blood Edward Island. That is until she meets up with a ghost of a young boy named D.
A ghost? Ashley, can you see me? Yeah.
D has some sort of connection to this island, but he cannot recall his past. The two find some common ground. Ashley wants to know the secret behind why her mother Sayoko was murdered and why her dad disappeared for so many years. D wants to uncover his past and believes that the truth is somewhere in the mansion. Together they make their way through the mansion, solving puzzles and reading documents related to the Edward lineage. For the most part, the original story of Two Memories is intact, with only slight deviations near the end. Outside of the obvious higher graphical fidelity, I'm left to wonder what the aim was behind many of these modernizations. Yes, you can roam around in a 3D space, but nothing substantial was added to that 3D space to justify the inclusion of the exploration. There's like no additional platforming, you're locked to the ground, the interaction with the world is far more limited as they removed the majority of the puzzles that required a touch interface, even though the Switch does have a touch interface. Not that I would expect Nintendo to pack in a stylus, but more of I was disappointed how underutilized the feature set of the Switch was. I would have much rather respected the choice to force the player to utilize Joy-Cons as part of the puzzle solving and gameplay, beyond just basic button input. The closest the Recollection gets to the implementation of motion controls is a couple of puzzles where you have to waggle the entire system around, and they're definitely on the lower end of the quality quality spectrum. This is a platform exclusive just like the original games. So let's just pretend that's the case. I look at something like the WarioWare series, more recently WarioWare Move It. Intelligent systems forced the player to commit to using the Joy-Cons and would train and prompt them to change up their playstyles to adapt to the micro scenarios. Even in these short bursts of pretending, it gave way to more meaningful immersion than what the Recollection attempted here.
Not bad!
Let me remind you, the original game implemented every single gimmick of the system to immerse you in the game world. And over here, they're using like maybe 20% of the Switch's possible features as part of the experience, and what can I say? I was let down. Going through my footage, I counted 11 total puzzles in the Two Memories remake, which is under half of the puzzles included in the original. I think maybe the Switch Lite came into play when it came to puzzle design. They didn't want to risk that some players might not have an extra set of Joy-Cons, so instead of coming up with puzzles with multiple configurations, they just came up with a standard set of generic puzzles, and that's a real shame because the original was defined by its unique and creative puzzles. As cool as it is to see a 3D representation of the interiors of the Edward Mansion, I feel a lot of the atmosphere is just lacking, and that probably has a lot to do with how quiet the soundtrack is in the mix. I cranked it up to 100 and it still doesn't feel present within the game world. There's just not that haunting, lonely melody with sustained string synths that were omnipresent throughout the Nintendo DS version. The remake still retains some of the sound samples, like when you hear a xylophone at the completion of a puzzle. Ultimately, the score here was an afterthought, largely forgettable, and sometimes not even audible. I do want to throw some compliments their way. The redesign of the DAS is pretty cool and kind of helpful in following the story. You can now look at an entire relationship tree, which develops and adds more details as the story progresses. You can also take a look at all the photos you've taken throughout, and the DAS is used to scan these little QR code cranes left by Richard. They allow you to unlock journal passages, which gives some background into what Richard was doing on the island this entire time. These existed in the original game, only represented by loose DS cartridges you would find on the ground. The aesthetic upgrades are the game's biggest selling points. It's always nice to see some more work by Tasuke, and some of the original sketches that he made for Another Code are now preserved in high definition. If anything, this game serves as a nice art gallery to Kanasaki's work. There are some weird alterations that were made to the look of certain characters, which does affect one of the game's biggest twists, so I will be talking about some spoilers in this section. At the end of Chapter 2, the gang runs into who they presume is Richard Robbins, Ashley's father. He's presented as a blonde-haired man with a ponytail. Captain Fox remarked that he had only had one other customer that he ferried out to Blood Edward Island, a mysterious blonde-haired man, and Ashley believes that could possibly be her father.
I mean, this could be my dad we're talking about.
Ashley was raised by her Aunt Jessica, who is the sister of Richard. Now, we have to operate under the presumption that there were no family photos at Jessica's house that Ashley could look at and say, oh, that was my father? This blonde-haired guy? And we also have to presume that Ashley never once asked Jessica what her father Richard was like, and that a conversation never took place where Jessica said he was a tall blonde-haired guy that wore glasses. If those two things happened in the background, there would be no plot hole in the original Another Code. However, the entire game's story hinges on a case of mistaken identity, and for the life of me, I just don't know how she could make that mistake here. At the end of Chapter 2, Ashley runs into a tall blonde-haired man who she presumes is her father. However, this turns out to be a guy named Bill, who has ulterior motives and is a bad guy. Ashley later comes to find her real father, Richard, who has brown hair in the remake. remake. As I said, this mistaken identity makes more sense in the original, but over here it's like, oh, hey Ashley, your father had brown hair, dark brown hair. So when a random guy in the mansion shows up with blonde hair, she should just be like, oh, hey, wait a minute. I think the game's plot benefits the most from the gift of hindsight. They wrote the remake to the first game with the remake of the second game in mind. There are some connections to Lake Juliet and Hotel Dusk that were not firmly established in the original games. The captain gets a name. It's Captain Fox. And we know this because he named his ship after his wife, Rosa, the maid from Hotel Dusk. Of course, there's also the inclusion of Pinky Rabbit, which is a mascot within the greater Cing universe. There's a blatant reference to Kyle Hyde, who appears in this game as a fictional character in a mystery detective novel, but I think that's more of a coy reference than it is writing Hotel Dusk out of the universe, and I'll explain more a little later. At the very beginning of the game, you see an R&J bear keychain that Richard placed on the underside of this stool for some reason. This is one of the firm connections to Lake Juliet. At the very end of the game, we find out Bill was being manipulated by a character from the sequel, which hooks the whole thing directly into Another Code R. For the most part, the game is very faithful to the original script, and the additions that were made, I felt, enhanced the overall enjoyment I had with Two Memories. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the Another Code R, A Journey into Lost Memories remake, and it was quite the whiplash for me because the ending of Two Memories abruptly cuts into Another Code R with almost no warning. Before I dig too deeply into the Another Code R remake, let's talk about the original for a minute. Another Code R, A Journey into Lost Memories was the direct sequel to Another Code / Trace Memory. Unfortunately, North America never got this title because Nintendo of America refused to localize it, and that caused a massive financial hit to Cing's bottom line, and I believe is partially responsible for their later bankruptcy. For the longest time, this game was a forbidden fruit, and I recall modding my Nintendo Wii in order to play it. The story takes place a couple of years after the events of Trace Memory. Ashley now has a new DAS modeled directly after the Nintendo DSi, and you begin the game by calibrating it to her face, and then she gives you a recap of the events that happened in the prior game. The introduction in the original is dramatically different than it is in the remake. Not only do we get a sizzle reel of all the various events that had happened in the past, but we also get a glimpse into Ashley's home life with Jessica. There's a big Battle of the Band competition coming up that Ashley's been practicing for. Richard, her father, has been absent for a few years because he's been working at a lab in Lake Juliet, and he calls her over for a little father-daughter time. She grabs a pendant and takes a bus over to Lake Juliet. Through a series of dreams, we once again get to see how the murder of her mother Sayoko has affected her. Upon exiting the bus, she's suddenly assaulted by a shadowy figure that takes her bag and runs off into the woods. And this is the game's first mystery: who stole Ashley's bag? The game is presented in a 2.5D perspective. The camera is fixed, and you use the Wiimote to guide Ashley around on a locked plane. It follows heavily in the tradition of the old point-and-click adventure games, and there's a humongous focus on the little details that you can examine throughout the journey. The characters all have a bit of cell shading, and the environment itself has a lot of different watercolor elements to it. Most of the environments are pre-rendered and from a forced perspective, and you can use the pointer to click on various objects for a better look and clarifying details. I love this granular approach to adventure games. Even though a lot of this detail is unnecessary to the mystery itself, it's still fun to poke around. Another Code R is defined by its unique style. When you walk into an environment, the 3D objects converge upon each other and forms the room. Or when Ashley travels between various parts of Lake Juliet, you'll watch bits of the environment pop up like a children's storybook. Lake Juliet itself looks like a Bob Ross painting come to life. A lot of the essence of Lake Juliet was sapped out during the conversion for the remake. And after seeing what they did in the remake, I have some great concerns for what they're gonna do when it comes to Hotel Dusk. How are they going to maintain that unique griminess to the look of Hotel Hotel Dusk with its rotoscoped animated comic look to it. The Another Code R remake skips directly to the bus ride to Lake Juliet. We're not given any look into Ashley's life with Jessica or any prelude into the Battle of the Bands thing. We're just on a bus and they cut to a cell phone call she had with her father. As soon as she steps off the bus, she's ambushed by Matthew, who steals her bag. No mystery as to who stole it. She chases after him, but he disappears. They just rush the introduction of the game right out the door. So here we are in the remake. You'll note that Ashley has a different appearance. She's a couple years older. She's wearing flannel and rock and roll shirts, very grunge-like. Lake Juliet has that muddy texture, low draw distance quality of a modern-day Pokemon game on the Switch. All of the limitations of the Nintendo Switch hardware are readily apparent. Lake Juliet is a lot smaller in scale. It's lacking its distinct style from its Wii predecessor, and all the 3D objects have just been strewn about in a vain attempt to mask all the terrible texture mapping on the ground. For some reason, every character in this remake got a complete cosmetic overhaul, or in some cases were deleted from the plot entirely to cut corners. For example, Tommy Harrison, the clerk at the guest house, no longer resembles Shaggy Rogers. They gave him a clean-cut baby face in the remake. Dan Maxwell, the nosy park ranger that helps Ashley find her missing bag, has a new hat in the remake, and that's it. Right out of the gate, I noticed that they eliminated Ashley's multiple ways to respond to conversations. For the most part, the player has no input on what Ashley's going to say next. She doesn't pantomime her expression in the moment. Also, they've eliminated all the inner monologues that Ashley had in the original games, where she would talk to herself and describe to the player how she was feeling, and occasionally other characters in the story would remark like, "Hey Ashley, why are you talking to yourself?" That distinct bit of her personality is just erased. Allow me to correct myself. She doesn't have inner monologues, but inner thoughts this time around. They happen so infrequently here that I almost forgot they existed at all. They still cut a majority of all of her monologues. A lot, and I mean a lot of the game's events are out of sequence or cut entirely to move things along at a quicker pace. When Ashley goes to meet up with her father at the campsite, he's now having like a cookout, and all these members from JC Valley, the lab where he works, show up in the remake, but you don't meet them until much later on in the original game. There's supposed to be a father and teenage daughter dynamic where Ashley is justifiably upset with Richard because he's been an estranged father for most of her life, and then he also left her again to go work on this new project, and that is underplayed at best here.
What's wrong? Not feeling well? Are you tired from the bus ride?
No. Isn't it obvious?
Oh, of course. If your tummy hurts, the bathroom's right over there.
That's not it.
In this game, the new piece of technology is called the RAS, which is a magical hacking bracelet that's used to open all the locks around Lake Juliet. But like the other remake, it's missing like half the features of the TAS, which was the technology in the original game. This thing that looks like the Wiimote. Yeah, it's one of those fourth wall connecting immersive bits where they wrote the Nintendo technology into the plot so you would feel a deeper connection to the events of Another Code. That same layer of connection just isn't present in the remake. In the original, Ashley would use the TAS to solve these locked door puzzles, and you would have to do things like manipulate how you held the Wiimote, combine various buttons, and in one case, you would actually have to hit the home button so it creates this cross-section of the code so you can read the true code to unlock a door. This is once again the outside-the-box thinking in the puzzle design that the original presented that is nowhere to be found in the remake. Ashley also gets an upgrade to the DAS, where she can hack into all the cameras at Lake Juliet and get various vantage points of where the various characters are. Kind of a little spy operation going on. She doesn't get that upgrade. Instead, she gets an upgrade to scan water with a button press. And she only does it twice in the game, so you don't really get your hands dirty at all. They also implemented another unique gimmick. Throughout the entirety of the game, you're only required to use the Wiimote, with no attached accessories. Later into the story, Ashley comes across this puzzle box left by her late mother. After solving this puzzle, Ashley uncovers a module for the TAS that resembles a nunchuck. And in this one moment, the player has to attach the nunchuck, which downloads additional data to the TAS, and Ashley hears her mother's voice for the very first time. What can I say? I'm easily impressed by gimmicks, and I wish the remakes would at least attempt to breach the fourth wall and do something memorable with the given technology. If you're not bringing clever puzzles or gimmicks to the table, and you're not evolving the premise in any meaningful way beyond graphics nearly 20 years later, then what are you doing here? There are even less puzzles in this remake. There are 14 total puzzles, which is like 60% less than the original game. There are less mysteries to solve, less areas to explore, and also less characters than the original. I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let's get back to the story. So Ashley is visiting Lake Juliet to meet up with her father, but she also discovers that she had once visited Lake Juliet with her mother before she died. Ashley wants to discover the true reason for her visit and recover her lost memories. In the original, Ashley is frustrated that she has to go to Lake Juliet to meet up with her father because she feels that he's just gonna flake on her again, which he ends up doing. He gets called back to the lab and she's upset because she thinks she's wasting her valuable practice time for the big Be the Band concert. The original really taps into what her teenage life is like, her love of music, and she even has a friend that she runs into from school named Janet Rice, represented by this ginger kid with pigtails. Janet Rice is entirely different because of the fact that she doesn't know Ashley. They didn't go to school together. That's the only difference here. Okay, I lied. They cut out a character named Sam, who's a drummer for Tommy's band, and combined Sam and Janet Rice into one character called New Janet Rice. Throughout both games, Ashley has somewhat of a rival by the name of Elizabeth Alford. She's her dad's boss's daughter. She's got that whole spoiled brat rich kid energy. At first, we think she's just being unreasonably mean, but as the story goes along, we find out more details about her character. We find out about her parents' divorce. Her dad left her mom for a younger woman. We find out her dog Princess ran away, and it's been years since she's last seen her. And also, in the original game, we find out she grew up as a chunky little kid, and those elements humanize Elizabeth to us in some way, and Ashley and her eventually make amends. In the remake, Elizabeth almost has no character development whatsoever. She just goes from 100% bitch to 100% forgiven, and she finds her dog, who's only been like missing for a few days. There's no dimensions to this version of Elizabeth, and for that, I'm disappointed.
Could you just leave already? You're so annoying.
I want to talk briefly about the character Bob Fox. Bob was the connective tissue between Trace Memory and Hotel Dusk and another Code R. In the original game, he was the son of both Rosa and Captain Fox. There's a photo of him that can be found in Hotel Dusk, and he has his father's red nose. But in the remake, he's now the brother of the captain, and he was also in a band with Ashley's father, Richard, who played the keyboard in the band. But later on in the game, when you go to Richard's office, you see this photo of a blonde-haired Richard who's playing guitar, just like Ashley. In the original game, he played guitar and he had blonde hair. In the remake, he has brown hair and he's a keyboardist, but he also had blonde hair and he had a guitar. Don't ask me, I didn't write it.
He's no slouch on piano, you know.
I didn't know, actually. I can't believe he can play piano.
He told me he played keyboard in a rock band back in the day.
Along the way, she runs into a young boy named Matthew Caruso. Matthew is a runaway child, and he came to Lake Juliet to find clues to help him find his missing father, who ran a resort at Lake Juliet called Caruso Resort before it was mysteriously shut down. Together, Ashley and Matt uncover all the mysteries of Lake Juliet. Over in the remake, Matthew is presented as just an annoying stock anime kid number 5. His voice actor doesn't do a great job at conveying Matthew's trauma, and I just couldn't find it in myself to care about his plight.
And 5 years ago, he was abducted from here.
By who?
Isn't it obvious? The gang of kidnappers!
In the remake, we see the ghost of Matthew's sister Kelly all throughout the game, instead of just showing up at the climax of his story as she's moving on to the great beyond. Instead of Matthew's father jumping off the clock tower, it was Matthew and Kelly were playing on the clock tower, and then she fell off and died, and therefore they boarded up the clock tower. Now we can't get a view of Lake Juliet anymore, and you can't see the dragon that lives in the lake. You can actually see a dragon pop up in the post-game of Another Code R. There's also a critical moment in the original game where Matthew gets suddenly sick and he's about to die of a fever, and Ashley has to turn to the old curmudgeon Miss Graham, who gives Ashley a recipe for some medicine that Ashley has to concoct herself and deliver to Matthew to save his life. That entire arc just gone in the remake. Also, Miss Graham's relative, Lucy Graham, is just not in this game at all. They wrote her character out and replaced it with Bob from the burger shop standing there to say, hey, you better watch out for Miss Graham, she's an angry old woman. The most egregious offense to Matt's character is his conclusion in the remake. In the original game, Matthew's father was on the run from some shady characters, and a reporter covering this story leaves Matthew with a clue to where his father was last seen. Matthew's story doesn't get wrapped up, it leads into a potential of another game where maybe Matthew and Ashley could work together to track down his father. In the remake, Matthew meets the ghost of his sister Kelly and apologizes for not protecting her and her untimely death, and both Matthew's sister and Matthew's ghost mom appear and they all forgive each other and they move on to the spirit realm. At the exact same moment, the reporter tells Matthew that, hey, your dad's actually been alive this whole time, but he's been in a coma. And guess what? This exact moment, he just woke up from the coma and he wants to see you now. And then he takes Matthew and they drive away out of the plot forever. What a send-off. Now, if it sounds like I'm sitting here nitpicking the plot, it's only because I have the original games fresh in mind. But after having played all 4 games, I can tell you the original Another Code R gave enough time for this story to breathe. There was so much interesting content going on in the original game script that at the conclusion of each chapter, you would get a recap where you had to recall the major events. These flat out don't exist in the remake. You were introduced to each character, you learned about their inner struggles, they had some sort of character flaw or problem in their life, and the story would give them enough time to develop these issues. I especially felt that way about the character Richard Robbins in the original. You get to read about all his varying stages of grief in his notes, and him trying to juggle a relationship with his daughter, with the breakthroughs in memory technology he's having at work, and how that work led to the destruction of his life and the death of Sayoko, and the mercy and forgiveness he shows to the game's antagonists. I don't know why, but the performance of Remake Richard is as wooden and emotionless as can be. He comes off as less a neurologist and more in the camp of neurologically impaired.
Ugh, not good.
What's wrong?
Someone's accessing top secret data.
Holy shit. You know, there's not too many people around who can develop a sophisticated virus like this one.
I'm not gonna spoil what happens in the ending of this game. They did something radically different than the original game. It's a little far-fetched, and it didn't work for me, and I don't think it carries the same emotional gut punch. But if this is your first time playing through the Another Code series, and you don't have those biases fresh in mind, then it's a serviceable enough one and worth seeing through to the end. However, I will throw a major compliment to the credit roll sequence here that Tosuke animated in the rotoscoped Hotel Dusk style, and they even included a cheesy song to bring it all home. I absolutely loved all these little portraits that show up during the credit sequence. As I said, this game stands mostly as an art gallery for Tosuke's work, and I was incredibly excited to see the back profile of Kyle Hyde at the very end, giving the slightest tease of a Hotel Dusk remake. I'm conflicted about recommending this. I don't think it's a great entry point for new players because it misses what made the original games so unique. Picking this up at $60 is kind of a slap in the face, but I totally get it if you choose to support it, because personally I wanted to throw more money Cing's way because I didn't get that opportunity to support another Code R and The Last Window because they never came out to America. Even though I've outlined many flaws with this Recollection, I'm still happy it exists, and I hope it does something out there for a new generation of players who have never experienced the originals. But I hope it also inspires those very same people to go back and try the originals. Overall, I'd recommend checking out the demo, wait for this game to go on sale. I've been Hikiko, I'll see you all next time.